Hi, I'm Steve Rolls from Transform Drug Policy Foundation, here at the DPA conference in Denver. It's quite a fascinating time, particularly to be here, because Colorado is obviously one of the first jurisdictions, in fact the first jurisdiction anywhere in the world that's set up a legalised and regulated market for non-medical use of cannabis. So to have a drug law reform conference here is quite fascinating. There's a sort of sense of celebration amongst people here, particularly the Colorado folks. It's been very interesting to see the legal market in action. Been visiting the grow areas and some of the dispensaries and shops, and talked to a lot of the people involved, and begin to explore some of the lessons that Colorado and Washington are going to have as the ripples from what's happening here spread out around the world. It's also interesting to see that there's a lot of people from Latin America. There's a lot of people from Uruguay and Mexico and other places in Latin America have come to this conference. Obviously Uruguay is exploring a legalization cannabis model, but a very different one. So much less kind of commercial free market model, much more of a sort of state regulated, almost a monopoly model. I mean, it's very interesting for policy analysts such as myself to see. It's going to be interesting over the next couple of years to see how the different models play out, because I'm sure mistakes will be made, some things will work, some things won't work, and there's going to be lessons for other jurisdictions and other governments as they approach this issue, not least of course in the UK, where the issue is building momentum politically and in terms of public opinion, but seems to have stalled somewhat in terms of actual frontline politics of the government. Or at least there's a tension between the Conservatives, who are very anti-reform, and the Lib Dems, who are very much in favour. But at least that debate is happening in the UK as well. I've no doubt that what's happening here in terms of Washington, Colorado and Uruguay and other experiments around the world is all going to feed into the UK debate. So it's a fascinating time, and it's a fascinating conference to be at.
What effect do you think it's going to have actually within, I suppose, general reform of other substances and criminalisation and?
Well, I mean, obviously, this is we should be clear. This conference isn't just about cannabis. It's just it's kind of been a focus of interest for me in this particular visit, because Transform's just produced a guide to cannabis regulation, which we'll be publishing in about a month's time, and that'll be free online, but it'll also be in print. And we're launching an event in New Zealand. So I've been very interested in the cannabis stuff on this particular visit, but it's by no means dominating the conference. There's a lot of stuff about harm reduction, there's a lot of stuff about naloxone, there's a lot of stuff about violence in transit and producer countries. So a lot of those issues are being discussed here as well. In terms of where cannabis fits in, I think whether we like it or not, cannabis is inevitably going to be breaking the mould in terms of drug policy reform. By far the most people use cannabis. It's generally seen as one of the less risky of the illegal drugs. And people are fairly familiar with regulation models for cannabis because they're at least quite similar to alcohol and tobacco regulation. And people have also seen the coffee shops in the Netherlands, and there's a certain familiarity around cannabis legalisation, which there isn't really for legalisation regulation of other drugs, whether that be stimulants or opiates or sort of party drugs. So there's some very interesting and important debates to be had there, and I think the cannabis reforms will be opening that up and creating some space for those debates in the future, but they are still some way off. The cannabis issue is kind of very present because it's actually moved from theory to reality. It's moved from the political mainstream into, it's moved from the margins into the political mainstream, but it's also moved into reality decisively, and nothing can make that more clear than, you know, visiting a grow room with 84,000 plants. A company that's producing 2 tons of cannabis a month for a legal domestic industry, which is what I did yesterday, which was quite bizarre really after all these years in reform to actually see legal production in action. And it all seems to be very sensible and well regulated and, you know, mature and responsible, and, you know, I have concerns about some of the marketing stuff that goes on here, but we're in America and it's quite difficult to control some of those things. But that's why, in a way, I think it's also useful we're getting the lessons from Uruguay as well. Gas is the UN, how all this cannabis reform is impacting at the UN international law level is a very interesting area, because clearly doing this, having a legal model for non-medical use of cannabis, is in breach of the conventions, and so the consensus around the kind of prohibitionist paradigm is not just crumbling, it's actually decisively fractured now, because a number of jurisdictions are now in breach of the conventions. They've moved away decisively from the basic prohibitionist tenets that underlie those conventions. That's a real challenge for the international legal system, because it's no longer really tenable in its current form, and the tensions there are out in the open. So there are countries now, I mean, the US, which has so long been the cheerleader of prohibition, is now effectively in breach of a convention that it was very much the architect of. And they've very much been the cheerleaders of that whole paradigm. So for them to be leading in some ways the reform of, away from that, it's quite a strange situation to be in. We're in uncharted territory, I think, in terms of international law and the conventions, but I think it's very clear, and political observers at the UN will tell you, and certainly from my experience of going to UN events, that there is a sense of resignation within the high-level forums that something has to change. What that is, or how it will be, or how it's going to play out over the next few years isn't really very clear yet, whether the treaties are amended, or whether groups of countries withdraw from the treaties, or whether a new treaty that's more flexible somehow replaces the existing one. It's not clear how it's going to happen, but something has to give, because at the moment we've got an unsustainable tension between the increasing numbers of reform countries on not just on cannabis. It's going to spread out to other drugs inevitably in the next decade or so. And a legal system which doesn't allow them to do what they want to do. And given that that legal system is supposed to represent the interests of member states, clearly something has to change, especially because the US, which is so central to the whole international discourse, is now the country that's in breach. So it's a very interesting time. There's been lots of interesting discussions about that as well.